podcast of the Emergency Podcast System. Had this been a real podcast, you would leave edified and entertained.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Emergency Podcast System. I'm your host, Pete Cantillon, and this week I want to talk to you about publishing. Now, before we get going, I want to tell you a little bit of some exciting news. At my end, I recently published my first collection of poetry. It's a 121-page softcover book, as well as a Kindle ebook that contains just over 90 poems from the past few years, and it's super exciting. I didn't realize how cool it would be to take that content and put it into a tangible format, and so it triggered this morning's subject of publishing, and at least my experience with publishing. So the book is called Psalms of Bone and Sinew, and it's available on Amazon, anywhere. It will be carried in some local stores here in Morden as well. One of the things that was exciting about the release, now, just so you know, I put this together because I wanted something tangible, mostly for my kids, my wife, and some members of my family. It was not meant to be much more than a tangible expression of what I've been doing for the last more than 35 years. I have a blog that's almost 20 years old now that contains a great deal of my poetry, but, it's not great to have to sift through 20 years of blog posts to read and appreciate someone's content. So those were some of the reasons why I wanted to put this together. And to be frank, I just like the idea of holding something tangible. So I went through this process to publish this. Now, the manuscript I had created over the last couple of years, and I submitted it to one publisher, but it was sort of a half-hearted attempt, and while it was, quote, appreciated, wasn't picked up. And, that's fine. I'm not one to submit my stuff very often. It's not a fear of rejection as much as it is that when I write for me. I post it to my blog. I sometimes share it on other social media platforms. But generally speaking, I write because I have to write. I don't write to make money, and hell, anybody who's a poet knows you're not writing to make money. Certainly, if you manage to get, be one of the few lucky ones who gets picked up by a publisher, and you're still not making much of a living, as a poet, certainly. And just like the NHL or any professional sport, it's only a very tiny fraction of authors, writers, poets who can make a living. And it's one hell of a slog to get to that place. There's a lot of self-promotion, a lot of marketing. So one of the interesting things about the book is in the first week of its release on Amazon, it actually hit the Hot New Bestsellers list. Hot New Releases bestseller list for poetry. It actually managed to get very briefly to number one. This was, you want to call that icing on the cake, I suppose. I was not anticipating it selling in high numbers, let alone being a bestseller. So to see that and to watch that and then to try to understand what in the world was going on was pretty exciting. I think to the best of my ability, what I can say is that I have a really dedicated network of followers and readers that have gone underappreciated for years. I am what some might call addicted to social media. I am operating on 6 platforms, not including my blog, and I always assumed, I have a few hundred followers, it's not huge, on each platform. I always assumed they all overlapped, but in trying to interpret why this particular book managed to become number one on the bestseller list, I had to do a little forensic work. And it seems to me that instead of having a single audience across 6 different social media platforms and a blog on top of that, it seems each platform has its own unique set of followers with a very small amount of overlap. And while I don't have any empiric evidence to back this up, all I can say is it seems likely that that's one of the reasons why it's done as well as it's done, is that there are more people following what I do than I realize. And I didn't even include this blog. I mean, the blog technically could be, an eighth platform for content. I just like creating content. And for no other reason than I have to get it out of my head. And that's one of the reasons why I've always written poetry. I find it to be the best way for me to express things that are going on inside of me when I'm inspired by something that's external to me. Poetry has always been my first release. So anyways, publishing. Over the years, I have, on occasion, submitted poems for publication, and as is usual, some get rejected, some get accepted. I would say if you had to come up with a rate of publication submission, I probably submit about once or twice every 2 to 3 years, a poem or two, here and there, as the mood strikes. Because, as I said before, publication is not really the reason I do what I do. It's just nice when it happens. So if I notice a call for submissions that overlaps very nicely with the style of poetry I write or something I've written recently, then I'll submit. An example of this was a poem I wrote called Coyote, which was picked up by G's Magazine, a great magazine that was originally published out of Winnipeg and then now is published out of Chicago. And that process was both torturous and gratifying. Torturous in the sense that this was a really long poem, a bit of a stream of consciousness, but it was a poem inspired by an experience I had in downtown Winnipeg one night. And, the poetry editor was merciless in the recommendations of cutting and changing. And so what was probably a 4-page poem got cut down to just under a page. And I think mostly that had to do with their format and the space they had available to them. So fine, I went with it. I rolled with it. I retitled it for my blog, Coyote Redux, and kept the original Coyote on the blog as well. And both of those poems made it into Psalms of Bone and Sinew, the collection I just released. But that was a good experience. It was nice to be able to get the poem out there on a widely read magazine. I have a few other poems that were published by the Lakeview Journal of Literature and the Arts, great publication. Other magazines that have published my content, Synesthesia, Poetry Scotland, Bricolage, and so those have been really good experiences. Sometimes they just publish them straight as I submitted it, and sometimes the editor will make a ton of changes. I'm not huge on punctuation. The Synesthesia poetry editor was not keen on my lack of punctuation, so we went back and forth and edited the poem, but mostly just for punctuation and not so much on the content side. And again, interesting experience. So, that's been my primary experience with publishing. Certainly haven't had a lot of experience at the book level. Although when I was executive director at the Canadian Fossil Discovery Centre, I helped shepherd our content into book format by a great writer, Larry Verstraete, who put together a fantastic book called Dinosaurs of the Deep about mosasaurs and other aquatic marine reptiles. And that was a really good experience. And working with the publishers, it was definitely interesting to see their process, how that worked out, and the marketing and promotion of that. So one of the issues I've had over the years with publishing is this sense, and it's not just a sense, I think it's a reality, that publishers, God bless them, they're all wonderful people who are truly patrons of the art, but they run a business. Publishing companies are businesses, small ones, big ones, medium-sized ones. They're all for-profit businesses. They're not going to publish something they think they're going to lose money on, and most of them aren't going to take the risk on publishing something from a new or unknown poet who hasn't already developed a substantial market on their own. So publishers will often step in and once a poet, for instance, I'm talking about poetry here. Poetry is not a huge market. Like, I have dear friends who are intensely heavy readers who have never purchased a poetry book in their entire life. So let's face it, poetry is not an enormous market to begin with. Nobody's making a lot of money or any money off poetry. So publishers are a little leery of that market because they're just not making money on it to begin with. So when they do choose what to publish, the primary criteria is as much about the potential for sales and the market that exists as it is about the content that they're printing. You can be the greatest publisher or poet in the world, but if nobody knows who you are, if you haven't done much work on your own to develop a market, it's very unlikely you're going to get a collection printed. And so, that always bugged me a bit because publishers have been and have become kind of the gatekeepers of art when it comes to literature and books. And the reality, at least as I see it, is that art is determined by the consumers of art. Art is determined by the market. Art is determined by the public space. Art is so subjective, and it could be said that art is in the eye of the beholder or the reader. And poetry is very much bound to that, as far as I'm concerned. And that's why I've always been happy with the perspective that I landed on, which is to create what I create for the sake of creating it. Because if I spent my life worried about building a market, selling my books, getting out there and finding a publisher, well, I think I'd have no hair left by now. The stress levels would be so insane. It's just a radically unfair and unpredictable space. And at the end of the day, because of the nature of who a publisher is, the fact that they are a business, I think artists need to remind themselves of this. And publishers should remind themselves of this. They may have gotten into the business and started their company because they have a deep love for the art. But at the end of the day, if the cash isn't coming in, they're not able to run their company. So there's a priority that has to be looked after. All that to say, that kept me looking periodically at the idea of self-publishing. And I bought into this idea that publishers are the gatekeepers of art. And if you're not published by a publisher, like Penguin or Allen Unwin or somebody like that, HarperCollins, then you're not really an artist. You're just a poser. And so I would avoid it because, again, I'm just creating content. But more and more, I wanted to see something of my work put into a tangible format. And there are a few ways to self-publish. One of the most common ways is to go to a publisher, a printing house, and arrange to pay a not insubstantial sum of money upfront in exchange for assistance with layout, content assistance, and then the paying for the costs, the capital costs related to printing the books and ordering a set number that you would then market and promote and sell on your own. That's fine. If you can do that, if you've got the money to be your own patron, I think that's great. Go ahead and do it. And then again, the gatekeepers of art, those who will determine whether that's art or not, will be the ones who consume it. And you just have to tone your ego down a bit if you end up with 200 books of poetry or whatever it is you published in your basement because nobody wanted it, because you were ahead of your time, or you're not speaking to the right people, or you're not marketing properly. Whatever the reasons, you have to be able to deal with that. Now me, I'm kind of cheap. So I'm not too keen and was never keen on paying for my own publishing process. And, I don't even enter my poetry into contests. And this is a bit of an aside, but I have an issue with almost, I'd say 90% or more of the poetry contests that exist today, because you have to pay a fee. $5, $10, $25, $50, $100. There's always an entry fee for most of these contests. And so what that felt like to me is that as a poet, you're buying a lottery ticket. Now, you have a selection committee who claims to know something about the art, and they probably do, and they're reading these poems, and they're coming down with their short list, and then ultimately they choose a winner and maybe a runner-up, and you win a prize, and you get some prestige out of that. But it always felt like you would be winning off the back of other poets, because the entire contest is funded by the people who are submitting their poems. And it always just felt a little greasy, always just felt a little opportunistic, and I wasn't fond of it. So for that reason, I don't submit my poems to any contests that cost money. I have an issue with that. So that's how cheap I am, just to give you a sense. Now, so that was one of the reasons, again, why I didn't want to pursue the pay for it yourself upfront publishing process. And so I started doing some research, and I came across Amazon's process, the Kindle publishing process that they've got. And as I was reading it, I began to realize that what they seem to have come up with is a nice hybrid from a publishing perspective. You're responsible for laying out your manuscript. You're responsible for proofreading it. You're responsible for putting it into a format that's submittable and printable. You're responsible for your cover, the cover art. You're responsible for its entire creation up to that point digitally. And then you submit it. And then it goes through a process within Amazon to ensure that it meets requirements from a printing perspective. You sign off that you own the copyright to all of the content so that they're not liable if you publish something that isn't yours, and they have a recourse if there's an issue in the future to remove it. So once you've done that, and it's approved, you can choose the format that you want to publish it in: electronic, or softcover, or hardcover, or all three. And so I decided to follow this process with the manuscript I had created, Psalms of Bone and Sinew. It was pretty easy. I had done a lot of work on it. They made it fairly simple and straightforward. One of the things I liked most about the Amazon process is you don't pay anything up front, whether you're Kindle e-publishing, whether you're softcover publishing, or hardcover publishing, because they have a large enough operation that they can print on a demands-based basis. So they're not losing anything. They have a royalty split of 60-40, 60% of the royalties go to the artist after print costs, and 40% goes to Amazon. This seems pretty reasonable on the basis of what I've seen in the publishing space in general. The other thing is you're responsible 100% for your market, for your market development, for your promotion. And this is where it can be a real challenge, I think, for a lot of artists. Because a lot of artists aren't necessarily experienced or versed in marketing and promotion, PR, the kinds of things that need to be done. And that's where the publisher really can shine. A publisher can have a fantastic pre-defined market of subscribers and purchasers who have come to appreciate the kind of content they release. And so when they release a new poet, for instance, there's already a set number of people who trust the publisher enough to believe that this is something they're going to want to read. So already you have a bit of a market in place. They know how to market it. They have their press lists. They know the bookstores. They're connected well with them. They have a distribution network, and your book flies out. It still may not sell well, but at least that's already there. With Amazon, you're on your own, except you do have their platform. You do have the Amazon platform globally that your book is released on. So there is some exposure there, and you don't necessarily have to have an enormous network of local bookstores. Now, Amazon is often seen as the flagship of the evil empire because it's a large company that's been allowed to do very well based on the laws in the different countries that it happens to operate in. And it's often seen as a the antithesis of the local bookstore, and to a degree it is. There's no doubt about that. There's nothing stopping an artist from selling on Amazon and in the local bookstore. You can do both. One of the nice things about the Kindle publishing process, as I've gone through it, is that you can order your books as the author at cost. So, for instance, my softbound, matte-covered, good quality white paper published book, well-bound, very professional, for me, costs just under $4 a book. If I want to purchase a large number of them and then distribute them to local businesses, which I'm actually going to be doing. I'm just waiting for them to arrive. I've got 4 local businesses so far that have agreed to sell on a consignment basis copies of the book. That's great. Very happy about that. Then I can set the price and I can adjust it if I need to, and we'll see how it does. So Amazon doesn't necessarily mean you're stuck with Amazon and that you're crushing the local bookstore as an option. Frankly, and there aren't a lot of local bookstores, to be frank. You can do both. And so I'm doing both. And that's why I like this whole hybrid method of publishing that Amazon seems to have developed. And to be honest, again, I think when I look at Amazon, in some ways it's democratized the publishing process for the author, for the poet. And I say that because, again, if you don't have the funds to self-publish through a regular platform, and if you don't have the connections and haven't been sweating and slaving away developing a market in major cities like Toronto and Vancouver, Montreal, and in places where the arts community is substantial in Canada, then you're not going to get published, for the most part, by a recognized publisher. And that's just the reality. And I don't think it's fair that there should be this assumption that if you're not published by a publisher, then you shouldn't publish at all. And so that's why I followed this process. And it's been very rewarding. Like I say, I was surprised and delighted that the book in the first week hit number 1 on the Hot New Releases bestseller list for poetry. That was well beyond my expectations. I wasn't even thinking about lists of any sort. And it's been sitting in the top 10 now for a few weeks. And that's great. I love that. I think that's gratifying and validating, and I would encourage anyone who has content to consider publishing through that process. One of the people who purchased the book and received it has said that this book could have come off the shelf of any bookstore and would have fit right in terms of the quality of the book. There was nothing about the quality of the book to suggest that this came from a self-published process. And that's really important as well, from a packaging, marketing, and promotional perspective, that you have something of substance when you're doing it. So those are some of my thoughts on self-publishing and the publishing industry in general. I have great friends in the publishing industry. They have enormous passion for publishing, for art, for poetry and literature, but they are bound by the rules that exist when you run a business. And one of those is that you have to be able to make money. And that can be a constraint for a lot of people who publish poetry. So, follow whatever path you choose if you're a poet or a writer, content creator. Self-publish, pursue publishers, do whatever you want, find a hybrid model. I loved the Amazon process, and I'll keep you posted. If you're looking for my book, you can find it on Amazon. Look for Psalms of Bone and Sinew, or look for my name, Peter Cantelon, Cantelon. Buy it. Let me know what you think. I really want to know, not just about the content, but about the quality of what you receive in terms of the paper and the binding and things like that. In the meantime, you've been listening to the Emergency Podcast System. We now return you to your regularly scheduled programming. Have a great day.